The sun had not yet fully crested the horizon when Amina began her daily dance with the flames. In the heart of the bustling roadside market, where the air was a thick soup of diesel exhaust and red dust, she was a vision of defiant vibrance. Clad in a brilliant pink floral dress that seemed to catch every stray beam of light, she tied her grey apron with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. To the commuters rushing toward the city, she was simply the food seller at the wooden stall, but to those who lived within the rhythm of the gutter, she was the queen of the roadside. Amina's stall was a humble construction of weathered planks, yet it possessed an invisible magnetic pull. Her laughter, a rich and melodic sound, often cut through the aggressive shouting of taxi drivers and the persistent honking of motorbikes. She didn't just sell food, she sold a moment of respite. Her hands, though youthful, moved with a seasoned grace, stirring massive blackened pots filled with a spicy tomato stew that sent fragrant plumes of steam swirling into the humid air. "Come and eat. Life is too short for an empty stomach," she would call out, her radiant smile acting as a welcome mat for anyone with a few coins and a heavy heart. She possessed an uncanny ability to remember how every regular liked their rice. Some preferred the bottom pot crust, others wanted extra gravy, and she served each with a dignity that suggested she was plating a feast for royalty. However, there was one guest who never paid in coin. Kofi stood at the very edge of the road, a small stationary figure amidst the chaotic flow of the morning rush. He was a boy composed of shadows and sharp angles, his tattered black shirt clinging to a frame that spoke of too many missed meals. The holes in his sleeves revealed skin dusted with the earth of the streets, and his hair, twisted into unkempt locks, held the debris of the city. Most passers-by stepped around him as if he were a pothole, a nuisance to be avoided, but Amina's eyes always found him. As the clock struck the peak of the breakfast rush, Amina reached for a specific white plate, not the chipped plastic ones she used for the rowdy laborers, but a clean, sturdy dish she kept tucked away. While the neighboring vendors watched with narrowed, judgmental eyes, Amina began the ritual of the free plate. She didn't just give him the leftovers or the scrap. With deliberate care, she scooped a mountain of fluffy white rice onto the plate, followed by a generous ladle of the richest part of the stew, ensuring a prime piece of meat sat right at the center. She ignored the hissed whispers of the woman selling dried fish next door, who often grumbled that Amina was inviting the plague by feeding the street children. "Kofi," Amina called out, her voice softening, losing the sharp edge of the marketplace hawk. The boy approached with a hesitant gait, his eyes wide and full of a quiet wonder, as they locked onto the steaming offering. When he reached the counter, she handed the plate to him with both hands, a gesture of profound respect. For a few minutes every day, the power dynamic of the street shifted. He was no longer a beggar, and she was no longer a struggling vendor. "Eat well, little one," she whispered, leaning over the counter so only he could hear her over the roar of the traffic. "For the world is big, and you will need your strength to conquer it." Kofi took the plate, his small fingers brushing against hers. He didn't speak. He rarely did, but the way he clutched the warm ceramic told her more than words ever could. He retreated to a nearby crate, eating with a focused intensity, while Amina returned to her pots, her smile never wavering. She knew her own margins were razor thin, and that the cost of that plate meant she might not buy a new pair of shoes this month. But as she watched the boy stand a little straighter after the first bite, she felt wealthier than any merchant in the city. To Amina, the extra plate wasn't a loss. It was an investment in a soul the rest of the world had written off. The midday heat clung to the marketplace like a damp wool blanket, amplifying the sharp smells of fermented locust beans and drying fish. Amina wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, her rhythmic stirring of the stew pot never faltering. As the lunch rush subsided, The usual chorus of whispers began to rise from the neighboring stalls, sharper and more caustic than the steam rising from the pots. To her left, Mama Ngozi, a woman whose face was as hardened as the sun-dried stockfish she sold, leaned over her counter, her eyes fixed on the empty white plate. Kofi had just returned. "Amina, my dear, you have a beautiful smile but a very empty head," Mama Ngozi called out, her voice carrying across the narrow alleyway to ensure the other vendors could hear. She gestured toward the boy, who was retreating to his usual corner in the dirt. "Every day I watch you serve that boy the best of your labor. Do you think he is a bank? Do you think he will sprout coins from those rags to pay you back for all that wasted rice?" A ripple of cruel laughter moved through the nearby stall. Jude, who sold plastic wares and was known for counting his pennies thrice before spending one, joined in with a wheezing chuckle. He shook his head, pointing a gnarled finger at the tattered holes in Kofi's shirt. "Look at him, Amina. He is a bottomless pit. You are pouring your life's earnings into a broken bucket. That boy is worthless to a businesswoman. He brings nothing but flies and bad luck to this corner." Amina felt the sting of their words, but she didn't let her smile dim. She knew their world was one of cold calculations and hard edges, where survival meant hoarding every grain and ignoring every outstretched hand. To them, Kofi was a line item that didn't add up, a deficit in the ledger of a hard life. "He isn't a bucket." "Per Jude," Amina replied, her voice steady and warm, though she felt the weight of their judgment pressing against her chest. "He is a child, and a child is never a waste." The mockery only intensified. "A child? He is a street dog." Mama Ngozi spat, waving a fly whisk dismissively. "While we are here struggling to pay the market union fees and keep the roof from leaking, you are playing mother to a ghost. If you spent as much time flattering the big-bellied men who actually have money in their pockets as you do feeding that beggar, you might finally afford a shop with a real door instead of this wooden birdcage." The vendors traded knowing glances, their pity masquerading as wisdom. They saw Amina's kindness as a fatal flaw, a leak in her boat that would eventually pull her under. They whispered about her soft heart as if it were a disease, something that would keep her trapped in the red dust of the roadside forever. Every scoop of rice she handed to Kofi was, in their eyes, a brick she failed to lay for her own future. Kofi, though sitting yards away, seemed to shrink further into the shadows of a parked truck, his head bowed low. He could hear the laughter. He could feel the sharp edges of the words "worthless" and "beggar" as they drifted through the air. Amina noticed his shoulders tighten, and for a moment her eyes flashed with a rare protective fire. She turned her back on the mockers, focusing instead on cleaning the white plate with a cloth she kept specifically for him. She made sure to handle it with the same care she would use for a piece of fine porcelain. A silent message to the boy and the market alike. In this stall, at this counter, his value was not measured by the coins he lacked, but by the humanity they both shared. The sun dipped below the ramshackle rooftops of the market, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft lavender. As the relentless heat of the day gave way to a cooler, gentler evening, the frenetic energy of the market began to wane. Most vendors, tired from a day of haggling and shouting, packed up their wares with weary sighs, eager for the solace of their homes. But for Amina and for Kofi, the twilight brought a different kind of ritual. After the last customer had shuffled away, leaving behind a scattering of coins and the lingering scent of spices, Amina would begin her own cleanup. Kofi, ever the quiet observer, would emerge from his usual hiding spot by the broken truck. Without a word, he would begin to help, carefully stacking the empty plastic stools, sweeping stray leaves and dust from Amina's small patch of ground. His movements were small, precise, imbued with a seriousness that belied his young age. It was his unspoken way of paying for the meals, a testament to his innate desire not to be seen as merely a taker. One evening, As Amina wiped down her counter with a damp cloth, her gaze fell upon a discarded newspaper. It was a day old, crinkled and smudged, destined for the bottom of a rubbish bin. But as her eyes scanned the bold headlines and smaller print, an idea sparked within her. She looked at Kofi, who was diligently sweeping the last of the dust. "Kofi," she said, her voice soft, like a breeze rustling through leaves. He stopped, broom in hand, and looked at her with eyes that held the wisdom of the streets, yet also a profound, untainted curiosity. Amina picked up the newspaper and flattened it against the counter. "Come here," she beckoned. "Today we learn a new kind of eating." Kofi approached, his brow furrowed in a slight frown of confusion. He had expected a story perhaps, or a gentle question about his day, but never a lesson. "What is this?" Amina asked, pointing to a large black number, printed boldly on the page, the price of petrol from the day before. Kofi's eyes followed her finger, unblinking. He didn't answer. He had seen numbers before, scrawled on chalkboards, or painted on the sides of buses. But they were always alien, abstract symbols that meant nothing to his world of hunger and survival. "This is 7, Amina explained patiently, drawing the number with her finger on the dusty counter beside the newspaper. "It is how many fingers you have on one hand, minus your thumb, plus 2 on the other. See?" She held up her fingers, counting them out slowly, clearly. Kofi watched, mesmerized. He had never had someone sit with him, with such deliberate patience, to explain something so fundamental. His world was about dodging, enduring, finding, not counting. Night after night, after the market emptied, and the stars began to prick holes in the dark canvas of the sky, Amina's stall transformed into a makeshift classroom. While Kofi devoured his dinner, always the best portions, carefully warmed, Amina would open the tattered newspaper. She taught him the alphabet, by pointing to the boldest letters in the headlines. "A is for Amina," she would say, tapping her chest with a smile. "B is for bread. C is for the courage you have, little one, to face another day." She used the classifieds to teach him about money, about addition and subtraction. If Mama Ngozi sells 5 fish for 10 naira each, how much money does she make? She would ask. Kofi at first struggled. His mind was accustomed to the immediate calculations of survival. How far to run, how quickly to snatch, how long until Amina's stall opened. But slowly, painstakingly, the abstract symbols began to coalesce into meaning. Amina never rushed him. She understood that his mind, though sharp, was burdened by the constant hum of hunger and uncertainty. She never made him feel stupid, even when he faltered. Instead, she offered encouragement, a gentle pat on the arm, a reassuring smile. "It takes time to grow a mighty tree," she would tell him. "But every day, a tiny root grows deeper." Their lessons became their secret language. While the other vendors grumbled about Amina's wasted kindness during the day, they were oblivious to the quiet revolution happening at her stall each evening. They didn't see Kofi's eyes light up when he recognized a word like market or food in the newspaper. They didn't hear his hesitant, proud pronouncements of numbers that just weeks before had been meaningless squiggles. Sometimes Amina would tell him stories from the newspaper too. Tales of far-off lands, of inventions, of people who started with nothing and built empire. She wove these narratives into his meals, feeding his mind as she fed his body. "You see, Kofi," she would say, her voice imbued with a quiet conviction, "the world is not just this dusty road. There are other roads, paved with knowledge, and you, my little scholar, have the feet to walk them." One evening, as Amina pointed to a simple word, dream, Kofi surprised her. He traced the letters with his finger, slowly, carefully, and then looked up at her, a rare, uninhibited smile spreading across his face. "Dream," he repeated, his voice a soft rock. It was the first word he had ever truly read aloud, and in that moment, under the faint glow of a single kerosene lamp, Amina knew she was planting more than just seeds of knowledge. She was planting seeds of hope in a heart that had known little else but despair. The harmattan wind began to blow, carrying a fine stinging grit that coated everything in a layer of grayish-white dust. It was the kind of morning that made the bones ache. Yet Amina arrived at her stall with her usual rhythmic energy, her pink dress a splash of warmth against the hazy horizon. She set the water to boil, and began the familiar ritual of sautéing onions and peppers, her eyes instinctively drifting toward the rusted truck, where Kofi usually waited for the sunrise. But the shadows beneath the vehicle were empty. The crate he used as a stool sat vacant, topped with a thin film of undisturbed dust. At first Amina felt only a mild flicker of concern. Perhaps the cold has kept him sleeping longer, she murmured to herself, ladling stew into the bowls of early shift workers. But as the midday sun reached its zenith and the market swelled with its usual cacophony of voices, the boy remained missing. By the time the evening sky turned to bruised purple and the secret lesson was meant to begin, the silence at her stall felt deafening. She sat with the day-old newspaper, staring at the word dream they had practiced the night before. But there was no small dusty finger to trace the letters with her. The next morning turned into a week, and the week stretched into a fortnight of agonizing uncertainty. Amina's vibrant laughter became forced, a thin veil over a growing dread. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, or a group of street boys ran past in a frantic scramble, her heart leaped into her throat. She began to close her stall an hour early, ignoring the loss of income to wander the labyrinthine alleys of the city's underbelly. She moved through the black market districts, and under the sprawling highway overpasses where the homeless huddled for warmth, showing a tattered photo she had once taken of Kofi on a cheap mobile phone. "Have you seen him? A boy with locks about this tall?" she would ask, her voice trembling. The responses were always the same: a shrug, a vacant stare, or a cynical laugh. In a city that swallowed children whole, one more missing boy was barely a footnote. Even her fellow vendors offered no solace. Mama Ngozi watched her frantic searches with a humph of disapproval. "You see, Amin, the bird has flown," she shouted one afternoon. "He's found a better place to beg or a faster way to steal. Stop wasting your spirit on a ghost." Amina ignored them, but the emptiness of the street began to feel like a physical weight. Despite the mockery and the mounting evidence that he was gone, she refused to let the ritual die. Every evening at 6 p.m., she would take a clean white plate, the sturdy one, not the plastic, and scoop a mountain of rice and the choicest cut of meat onto it. She would set it on the counter, the steam rising in a defiant prayer, and wait. She waited as the food grew cold. She waited as the flies began to circle. She waited until the very last kerosene lamp in the market was extinguished. Only then would she wrap the food in a banana leaf and give it to a passing stranger or a stray dog, her heart breaking anew with every discarded morsel. This went on for 30 days, a month of silent vigils and empties. The neighboring vendors stopped laughing and started looking at her with a pained kind of pity, as if they were watching a woman lose her mind. On the 31st day, Amina finally stopped cooking the extra portion. And she didn't stop because she had moved on, but because her soul felt as hollow as the empty crate by the truck. She sat in the dark of her stall, the newspaper yellowing on the counter, and realized that the boy hadn't just taken her food. He had taken the part of her that believed kindness could shield a person from the cruelty of the world. The queen of the roadside still wore her pink floral dress, but the sun seemed a little dimmer, and the dust of the market felt a lot more like a shroud. The harmattan wind began to blow, carrying a fine stinging grit that coated everything in a layer of grayish-white dust. It was the kind of morning that made the bones ache. Yet Amina arrived at her stall with her usual rhythmic energy, her pink dress a splash of warmth against the hazy horizon. She set the water to boil and began the familiar ritual of sautéing onions and peppers, her eyes instinctively drifting toward the rusted truck where Kofi usually waited for the sunrise. But the shadows beneath the vehicle were empty. The crate he used as a stool sat vacant, topped with a thin film of undisturbed dust. At first, Amina felt only a mild flicker of concern.
Perhaps the cold has kept him sleeping longer, she murmured to herself, ladling stew into the bowls of early shift workers. But as the midday sun reached its zenith, and the market swelled with its usual cacophony of voices, the boy remained missing. By the time the evening sky turned to bruised purple and the secret lesson was meant to begin, the silence at her stall felt deafening. She sat with the day-old newspaper, staring at the word dream they had practiced the night before. But there was no small dusty finger to trace the letters with her. The next morning turned into a week, and the week stretched into a fortnight of agonizing uncertainty. Amina's vibrant laughter became forced, a thin veil over a growing dread, every time a siren wailed in the distance, or a group of street boys ran past in a frantic scramble. Her heart leaped into her throat. She began to close her stall an hour early, ignoring the loss of income to wander the labyrinthine alleys of the city's underbelly. She moved through the black market districts, and under the sprawling highway overpasses, where the homeless huddled for warmth, showing a tattered photo she had once taken of Kofi on a cheap mobile phone. "Have you seen him? A boy with locks about this tall?" she would ask, her voice trembling. The responses were always the same: a shrug, a vacant stare, or a cynical laugh. In a city that swallowed children whole, one more missing boy was barely a footnote. Even her fellow vendors offered no solace. Mama Ngozi watched her frantic searches with a hump of disapproval. "You see, Amina, the bird has flown," she shouted one afternoon. "He's found a better place to beg or a faster way to steal. Stop wasting your spirit on a ghost." Amina ignored them, but the emptiness of the street began to feel like a physical weight. Despite the mockery and the mounting evidence that he was gone, she refused to let the ritual die. Every evening at 6 p.m., she would take a clean white plate, the sturdy one, not the plastic, and scoop a mountain of rice and the choicest cut of meat onto it. She would set it on the counter, the steam rising in a defiant prayer, and wait. She waited as the food grew cold. She waited as the flies began to circle. She waited until the very last kerosene lamp in the market was extinguished. Only then would she wrap the food in a banana leaf and give it to a passing stranger or a stray dog, her heart breaking anew with every discarded morsel. This went on for 30 days, a month of silent vigils and empty seats. The neighboring vendors stopped laughing and started looking at her with a pained kind of pity, as if they were watching a woman lose her mind. On the 31st day, Amina finally stopped cooking the extra portion. She didn't stop because she had moved on, but because her soul felt as hollow as the empty crate by the truck. She sat in the dark of her stall, the newspaper yellowing on the counter, and realized that the boy hadn't just taken her food. He had taken the part of her that believed kindness could shield a person from the cruelty of the world. The queen of the roadside still wore her pink floral dress, but the sun seemed a little dimmer, and the dust of the market felt a lot more like a shroud. The morning of the eviction arrived with a sky the color of cold. Amina had not slept. She spent the final hours of the night packing her few belongings into weathered sacks, her movements heavy and mechanical. The massive yellow bulldozers of the city council already sat idling at the edge of the road, their mechanical maws dripping with the grease of impending destruction. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, some recording with their phones, waiting for the inevitable moment when the wooden stall, the last relic of the old market, would be crushed into splinters. The men in charcoal grey suits stood by, checking their watches with clinical impatience. Just as the lead bulldozer lurched forward, its engine letting out a guttural black smoke roar, a new sound began to vibrate through the soles of Amina's feet. It wasn't the clatter of construction machinery, but a deep rhythmic hum that seemed to command the very air to go still. From the far end of the boulevard where the skyscrapers met the horizon, a flash of brilliant silver caught the morning light. The crowd gasped as a line of vehicles appeared, moving with a synchronized predatory grace that stopped the morning traffic in its track. 1, then 2, then 3. The count continued until 7 identical, shimmering silver Rolls Royces stretched down the dusty road like a string of priceless pearls, dropped into the mud. The sheer opulence of the convoy was an affront to the grit and poverty of the roadside. Each car bore a hood ornament that gleamed with a terrifying purity, and the silent rotation of their massive wheels seemed to flatten the very chaos of the street. The ground literally shook as the lead vehicle pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, its tires kicking up a cloud of red dust that coated the pristine silver paint. The other 6 followed, forming a protective, impenetrable crescent around Amina's fragile wooden stall. The bulldozers ground to a halt, their operators staring in slack-jawed confusion. Even the city council officials retreated, their clipboards lowered as the overwhelming aura of wealth and power radiated from the silent machines. The silence that followed was absolute. The honking of distant taxis faded into a dull murmur, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. Amina stood behind her counter, her hands clutching the chipped white plate she had been about to pack away. She looked at the wall of silver steel and tinted glass, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The neighborhood residents pressed forward, whispers rippling through the throng. Who are they? Is it the president? Are they here to buy them all? Suddenly, the rear door of the central Rolls Royce opened with a soundless click. A security detail in dark suits and earpieces stepped out with military precision, forming a corridor that led directly to the front of Amina's counter. The crowd surged, held back only by the silent authority of the guards. Every eye was fixed on the open door of the 4th car, where a pair of hand-stitched leather shoes touched the dusty earth. As the figure emerged, the contrast was jarring. The man was draped in a suit that likely cost more than the entire market block, yet he moved with a familiarity that suggested he knew exactly where the potholes were hidden beneath the dust. He didn't look at the skyscrapers or the luxury mall project. His gaze was locked entirely on the woman in the fading pink dress, who stood trembling behind a pot of cold stew. The man emerged from the silver depths of the Rolls Royce with a presence that seemed to command the very air to be still. He was tall and carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who had conquered worlds. Yet as his feet touched the red dust of the roadside, his pace slowed. He ignored the frantic whispers of the crowd and the bewildered stares of the city council official. His focus was singular, his eyes locked on the woman behind the wooden counter who looked as though she were seeing a ghost. Amina watched him approach, her breath hitching in her chest. Up close, the gold on his fingers and the sapphire links at his cuffs sparkled with a blinding intensity. But it was his face that made her hands begin to shake. There was a familiar sharpness to his jaw, a specific light in his eyes that time and wealth had not been able to erase. He stopped just inches from the splintered wood of the counter, the expensive fabric of his trousers brushing against the dust-coated planks. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The roar of the city seemed to fade into a dull hum, leaving only the sound of the harmattan wind whistling through the nearby skyscrapers. The man reached out, his hand clean and manicured, hovering over the spot on the counter where Amina used to tape the old newspaper. I remember the word dream, he said, his voice a deep resonant rasp that vibrated through Amina's very soul. You told me it was the most important word in the language because it was the only thing the world couldn't take away from me. Amina felt a tear track a hot path through the dust on her cheek. The wooden spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering unheeded into a pot. Kofi, she whispered, the name sounding like a prayer she had forgotten she knew. The man smiled, and for a fleeting second the billionaire vanished, replaced by the hungry boy who used to watch her from the shadows of the rusted truck. He reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke jacket and pulled out a small framed piece of fabric. It was a jagged scrap of black cloth, faded and thin, with a distinct circular hole worn through the center. The other vendors called these holes a sign of my worthlessness, he said, looking down at the scrap with a strange kind of reverence. But you, Amin, you told me these were the windows to my past. You said they were there so I would never forget where I came from, even when I reached the places you promised I would go. He looked up at her, his expression softening into a look of profound gratitude. I spent 15 years trying to become the man you saw when I was just a ghost in a tattered shirt. I went across the ocean. I worked in kitchens. I studied until my eyes bled. And I built an empire. All because I didn't want to prove the other vendors right. I wanted to prove you right. Amina reached out, the calloused fingers tentatively brushing the sleeve of his expensive suit. It was real. He was real. The boy who had vanished into the fog of the city had returned as a titan, draped in the silver and steel of his success. "They are here to take it all down, Kofi," she said, her voice breaking as she gestured to the idling bulldozers and the men with the clipboards. "They say there is no room for this place in the new world." Kofi turned his head slightly, casting a cold, sharp glance toward the city officials who now looked as though they wished the earth would swallow them whole. He turned back to Amina, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, protective light. "The world doesn't move unless I say it moves, Amina. They aren't here to tear anything down anymore. They are here to witness a coronation." Kofi stepped closer, his presence acting as a shield between Amina and the cold, mechanical world that had been threatening to erase her. He reached out and gently took the chipped white plate from her trembling hands, holding it with more care than he did the billion-dollar contracts that bore his signature. He looked at the porcelain as if it were a holy relic, a map of the boy he used to be, and the man he had become. "The day I disappeared, Amina, I didn't leave because I wanted to," he began, his voice dropping to a register of raw honesty that bypassed the crowd and the cameras. "I left because a man in a car much like the ones behind me now stopped and watched. He watched you teach me from that newspaper. He saw a woman who had nothing giving everything to a boy who was nothing. He was a scout for an international foundation, and he told me that if I had the hunger to learn that matched the hunger you were feeding, he would take me across the sea to a school where my mind could finally grow." He paused, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips as he saw the shock dawn on Amina's face. "I didn't have time to say goodbye. They were leaving for the airport right then. I walked away with only the tattered shirt on my back and the words you had carved into my heart. Every night in that cold, distant country, when the lessons were hard and the other students looked at me like I was a speck of dust, I would close my eyes and smell the spicy tomato stew. I would hear your voice telling me that the world was big and I was meant to conquer."
The city council lead, sensing the power shift, tried to step forward with his clipboard, but a sharp, silent gesture from one of Kofi's security detail froze him in his tracks. Kofi didn't even turn his head. He was too busy explaining the ledger of kindness that he had carried in his mind for 15 years. "I studied engineering and commerce, not for the money, but at the leverage," Kofi continued, his eyes shining. "Every company I started, every building I bought, was a step closer to this road. I tracked the development of this city from thousands of miles away. When I saw the plans for the Grand Horizon Mall, I knew they would come for this corner. I knew they would try to sweep you away like the dust they think you are. So, I didn't just come back to say thank you, Amina. I came back to balance the books." He took her hand, the skin rough from years of honest toil, and pressed it against the cool silver door of the lead Rolls Royce. "For every plate of rice you gave me when you had nothing, I have built a kitchen that will never run empty. For every lesson you taught me on a discarded newspaper, I have endowed a school in your name. You thought you were just feeding a homeless boy, but you were fueling the engine of a man who was determined to come back and buy the ground you stand on so that no one, not the city, not the law, not the rich, could ever tell you to move again." Amina listened, her heart overflowing with a mixture of disbelief and a profound, soaring pride. She looked at the man before her and finally saw the harvest of the seeds she had planted in the mud so long ago. Kofi wasn't just paying a debt, he was vindicating every moment of mockery she had endured, every cent she had sacrificed, and every prayer she had whispered into the Harmattan wind. The queen of the roadside realized that while she had been protecting a boy, the boy had grown into a titan who was now rebuilding her kingdom from the sky down. Kofi reached out and took the bright orange eviction notice from the counter. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the heavy paper down the middle, the sound of the rip echoing like a gunshot in the silent street. He didn't stop until the document was a shower of white and orange confetti, fluttering down into the red dust, to be trampled by his polished leather shoes. The lead official of the city council opened his mouth to protest, but one look from Kofi, a gaze forged in the boardrooms of the world's most powerful cities, silenced him instantly. "The Grand Horizon Luxury Mall will still be built," Kofi announced, his voice carrying to the very back of the gathered crowd. "But it will be built around this corner, because as of 4 o'clock this morning, I have purchased the title deed to this entire block, and this specific patch of earth is no longer a roadside stall. It is the headquarters of the Amina Foundation." The crowd erupted into a roar of cheers that drowned out the hum of the idling bulldozers. Amina felt as though the ground beneath her, which had felt so unstable only an hour before, had suddenly turned into solid rock. She looked at the wreckage of the eviction notice, and then at the 7 silver cars, realizing that the era of her struggle had officially come to an end. 6 months later, the dust of the roadside had been replaced by the scent of fresh mahogany and polished marble. The grand opening of Amina's Square was a spectacle the city would talk about for decades. Where the weathered wooden stall once stood, a state-of-the-art glass building now rose, a stunning fusion of modern architecture and traditional warmth. On the ground floor was a restaurant that seated hundreds, its air-conditioned halls filled with the same spicy aroma of tomato stew that had once drifted through the market's exhaust fumes. Amina stood in the center of a kitchen that gleamed with stainless steel, no longer hunched over a blackened pot on the ground, but leading a team of chefs in crisp white uniforms. But the heart of the empire wasn't just the food. Above the restaurant sat a multi-level school, the Kofi and Amina Institute of Excellence. It was a place where the shadow children of the streets, the boys in tattered shirts, and the girls with weary eyes, were brought in from the... Here they weren't just fed, they were given uniforms, books, and the same secret lessons. Amina had once scrawled on old newspapers, now taught by the best educators in the country. The ceremony reached its peak as Kofi and Amina stood together on a raised... Kofi was no longer the man in the bespoke suit. For this day he wore a traditional robe that matched the brilliant pink of Amina's new silk dress. He handed her a pair of golden shears, and together they cut a ribbon that spanned the entrance of the new complex. "You once told me that every root grows deeper every day," Kofi whispered to her as the cameras flashed and the neighborhood cheered. "Look at the forest you've grown, Amina." Amina looked out over the crowd. She saw the vendors who had once mocked her, now standing in the front row, their faces a mixture of awe and newfound respect. She saw the children entering the school, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes filled with the same dream she had seen in a young boy 15 years ago. She reached into her pocket and felt the cool, smooth surface of the chipped white plate, the only item she had kept from the old stall. She realized then that her flaw of being too kind had never been a weakness. It had been the cornerstone of an empire. As she looked at the silver Rolls Royces, parked in a neat row outside her new glass doors, she knew that while she had spent her life trying to save one boy from the hunger of the streets, he had spent his life making sure she would never have to face the world alone again. The queen of the roadside had finally been crowned, and her kingdom was built on a foundation of grace that no bulldozer could ever touch.